Picture this: you've committed a crime in 1750s Virginia. Maybe you stole a horse, killed a man in a tavern brawl, or counterfeited currency. The authorities are closing in. You have two choices: face the gallows or run. So you choose to run. You disappear into the vast American wilderness where there are no police databases, no fingerprints on file, no photographs circulating, no extradition treaties, no FBI most wanted list. Just thousands of square miles of untamed frontier where a man can vanish like smoke. But what happens next? Do you live out your days as a hermit in the woods? Do you reinvent yourself in a distant settlement where no one knows your face? Do you join a gang of fellow outlaws and continue your criminal ways? Or do you somehow transform from fugitive to respectable citizen, perhaps even becoming the very thing you fled, a lawman yourself? This is the untold story of the criminals who escaped justice in early America, the parallel lives they built in the shadows, and the strange, often ironic twists their stories took. From murderers who became ministers to thieves who became sheriffs, from outlaw communities hidden in swamps to fugitives who helped build new towns, welcome to the world of early American fugitives who got away. Historical context and background. To understand what happened to fugitive criminals in early America, we must first grasp the unique conditions that made escape both possible and complicated during the colonial and early national periods, roughly 1607–1830. Early America was a law enforcement nightmare. The colonies and early states possessed vast territories with sparse, scattered populations. In 1700, the total colonial population was only about 250,000 people spread across hundreds of thousands of square miles. By 1800, after independence, the United States had roughly 5.3 million people, but westward expansion meant population density remained low across most of the territory. Large regions, the Appalachian Backcountry, the Trans-Appalachian West, the frontiers of Georgia and the Carolinas, were barely governed at all. Law enforcement infrastructure was minimal and localized. There was no national police force, no state police, no coordinated system for pursuing criminals across jurisdictions. A sheriff's authority typically ended at the county line. Constables worked in individual towns or parishes. The concept of hot pursuit across boundaries existed in English common law, but practical enforcement was nearly impossible. If a criminal committed a crime in Massachusetts and fled to Pennsylvania, Massachusetts authorities would need to request extradition from Pennsylvania authorities, a process that required correspondence by mail, which could take weeks, cooperation between colonies or states with no obligation to assist each other, and significant expense that small jurisdictions couldn't afford. Communication technology was primitive by modern standards. There were no photographs, so wanted notices relied on written physical descriptions that could fit thousands of people. 5 feet 9 inches tall, brown hair, medium build. No telegraph until the 1840s meant that news of crimes traveled slowly, often by word of mouth or through newspaper notices that might take weeks to reach distant settlements. A criminal could commit a crime in Charleston and be living under a new name in frontier Kentucky before anyone in Kentucky even knew to look for him. Identity itself was fluid in ways modern Americans can barely comprehend. There were no driver's licenses, social security numbers, birth certificates for most people, or any systematic identification documents. A person was who they claimed to be, vouched for by their word, and perhaps the testimony of neighbors. This meant fugitives could genuinely reinvent themselves by simply traveling far enough that no one knew their past. Many legitimate settlers also used this anonymity to escape debts, failed businesses, or unhappy marriages. The frontier was full of people seeking fresh starts, which provided perfect cover for criminals seeking the same. The frontier areas offered unique refuge. The Appalachian Backcountry, the Ozarks, the Great Dismal Swamp on the Virginia-North Carolina border, the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, the bayous of Louisiana. These regions had populations of people living outside organized society, squatters on unclaimed land, escaped slaves and indentured servants, Native American communities, religious dissenters, and yes, fugitive criminals. Some areas developed reputations as outlaw country, where authorities rarely ventured, and asking too many questions about someone's past was both rude and potentially dangerous. Native American territories provided another escape route. Colonial and early American law had limited reach in indigenous lands. Some fugitives sought refuge with Native American tribes, either joining them as adopted members or living on the margins of indigenous communities. This was particularly common in the colonial period before Native American displacement intensified in the 19th century. Maritime escape was also common. Port cities offered opportunities to board ships and disappear to other colonies, the Caribbean, Europe, or beyond. Sailors famously asked few questions about a man's past. They cared only whether he could work. Piracy also attracted fugitives throughout the colonial period, offering both refuge from the law and opportunities for continued criminal activity at sea. Legal complications further enabled escapes. Colonial jurisdictions were fragmented. Each colony had its own legal system, and cooperation was voluntary. After independence, the Constitution's full faith and credit clause and the Fugitive Clause, Article IV, Section 2, required states to return fugitives from justice, but enforcement remained inconsistent until the Fugitive Act of 1793 provided a federal framework. Even then, the process was cumbersome and often ineffective, particularly for property crimes or cases where the fugitive had influential friends in their new location. This combination, vast territory, sparse population, weak communication, fluid identity, refuge areas, and jurisdictional fragmentation, created an environment where determined criminals could escape justice and build new lives. What those new lives looked like varied dramatically, from continued criminality to surprising respectability, as we'll see in the following cases. Case studies/real-life examples. Case Study 1. The Great Dismal Swamp Maroon Community, a refuge for fugitives, 1600s-1860s. The Great Dismal Swamp, straddling the Virginia-North Carolina border, served as one of early America's most significant fugitive refuges for over 2 centuries. This vast, forbidding wetland, covering over 1 million acres of cypress swamps, dense vegetation, and treacherous bogs, provided perfect sanctuary for those escaping the law. The swamp's maroon community, from the Spanish cimarron, meaning wild or untamed, consisted primarily of escaped slaves, but historical records also document fugitive white criminals, escaped indentured servants, army deserters, and Native Americans displaced from their lands. By some estimates, thousands of people lived in the swamp's interior at various points during the colonial and antebellum periods. What makes this case study fascinating is how fugitives didn't simply hide in the swamp. They built a functioning, if informal, society. Archaeological evidence and contemporary accounts describe semi-permanent settlements deep in the swamp's interior, accessible only by secret paths through the wetlands that outsiders couldn't navigate. These communities had their own social structures: food production, fishing, hunting, and small-scale agriculture on dry patches, and trade networks. Fugitive criminals who reached the swamp found a community that asked few questions about the past. A white man fleeing a murder charge might find himself living alongside escaped slaves fleeing bondage, deserters from colonial militias, and debtors avoiding prison. The shared status as fugitives from the law created an unusual social equality. In the swamp, your ability to survive mattered more than your race, class, or former crimes. The Maroons developed sophisticated systems for evading the occasional slave catchers or law enforcement who ventured into the swamp. Lookouts stationed at the swamp's edges warned of approaching threats. The communities moved periodically, abandoning settlements when they felt exposed. Some Maroons maintained secret contacts with slaves on nearby plantations, or with sympathetic free people of color who traded goods for the timber, charcoal, and shingles the Maroons produced. What's particularly remarkable is the longevity of some fugitives' stays in the swamp. Historical accounts describe individuals who lived there for decades, essentially creating entire lives outside the law. Some had families in the swamp, children who were born, raised, and lived their entire lives as fugitives without ever being part of official American society. The swamp also served as a temporary refuge for fugitives in transit. A criminal fleeing Virginia might spend weeks or months in the swamp before moving on to North Carolina or points further south, using the community's resources and knowledge to plan their next move. The Maroons' expertise in wilderness survival and their knowledge of secret routes through the swamp made them valuable guides for fugitives passing through. The Great Dismal Swamp community persisted until the Civil War era, when Union Army activities and the end of slavery eliminated the primary reasons for its existence. But for over 2 centuries, it represented a parallel society where fugitives of all kinds could escape the law and build lives that, while harsh and precarious, offered freedom from the justice systems they fled. Case Study 2. Samuel Mason, from Revolutionary War Captain to River Pirate, 1750–1803. Samuel Mason's trajectory from respected military officer to notorious outlaw leader illustrates how fugitives sometimes embraced rather than abandoned criminality after escaping the law, and how the frontier facilitated this transformation. Mason was born in Virginia around 1750 and served honorably as a militia captain during the Revolutionary War, fighting at the Battle of Vincennes under George Rogers Clark. After the war, he initially settled respectably in Ohio, but around 1797, facing legal troubles, possibly related to land fraud, he fled to the frontier wilderness of the lower Ohio River and Mississippi River, the lawless borderland between American, Spanish, and Native American territories. Rather than starting over with a clean slate, Mason formed one of early America's most notorious outlaw bands. Operating from Cave-in Rock, a natural limestone cave on the Illinois side of the Ohio River, Mason's gang preyed on river travelers. The cave's strategic location made it perfect for their operations. It was visible from the river and appeared to offer shelter to weary travelers. But once boats pulled in, Mason's men would rob and often murder the travelers. Mason's operation was sophisticated for its time. His gang posed as respectable river pilots, offering to guide boats through dangerous river sections for a fee. Once they had control of the boats, they would rob the travelers, steal the cargo, and sometimes kill witnesses. They would then either sell the stolen goods through fences in New Orleans or other river towns, or repackage and resell them to unsuspecting buyers. What makes Mason's case particularly interesting is how he built a criminal organization, not just a lone fugitive existence. He recruited other fugitives and criminals, creating a gang that at its peak numbered dozens of members. He established connections with corrupt officials and merchants who helped dispose of stolen goods. He moved between multiple hideouts, Cave-in Rock, islands in the Mississippi, and settlements in Spanish Louisiana where American law couldn't reach. Mason successfully evaded capture for years by exploiting jurisdictional chaos. When American authorities in one territory got too close, he'd move to another jurisdiction. When things got too hot in American territory, he'd cross into Spanish Louisiana. His knowledge of the river systems and wilderness allowed him to disappear when necessary and reappear in different locations. His criminal career finally ended not through effective law enforcement but through betrayal. In 1803, 2 of his own gang members, hoping to collect the substantial reward offered for Mason, killed him and severed his head to present as proof. However, in a darkly ironic twist, when the killers tried to collect the reward in Natchez, they were themselves recognized as wanted criminals and were arrested and hanged. Mason's story represents one path fugitives took. Rather than reforming, they used the frontier's lawlessness to continue and even escalate their criminal activities. The weak law enforcement and jurisdictional confusion that helped them escape initial crimes also enabled ongoing criminality. Mason's gang inspired other river pirates and contributed to the Ohio and Mississippi River regions' reputation as dangerous outlaw country in the early 19th century. Case Study 3. John Murrell, The Mythical Crime Syndicate, 1806–1844. The case of John Murrell reveals how fugitive criminals sometimes became legendary figures whose actual crimes were embellished into elaborate mythology, and how this mythology itself shaped frontier society's understanding of crime and justice. John Murrell was a real criminal. Born in Tennessee around 1806, he was convicted of slave stealing, a capital crime in the South, in 1834 and sentenced to 10 years in prison. But Virgil Stewart, a man who claimed to have infiltrated Murrell's gang, published a sensational account in 1835 titled, "A History of the Detection, Conviction, Life and Designs of John A. Murrell, the Great Western Land Pirate," that transformed Murrell from a common criminal into something far more dramatic. According to Stewart's account, which historians now regard as largely fictional or wildly exaggerated, Murrell led a vast criminal organization spanning multiple states with over 1,000 members. This mystic clan supposedly operated safe houses throughout the South and Southwest, had a complex hierarchy with elaborate initiation rituals, and engaged in every crime imaginable: horse theft, counterfeiting, robbery, murder, and especially slave stealing. Most sensationally, Stewart claimed Murrell was planning a massive slave insurrection for Christmas 1835, intending to burn cities, murder whites, and establish a criminal empire amid the chaos. The book became a bestseller and triggered panic throughout the South. Vigilante committees formed to hunt for suspected members of Murrell's gang. Several people were lynched based on accusations of being part of the organization. The Christmas insurrection plot, while baseless, contributed to Southern paranoia about slave rebellions and was used to justify harsher slave codes and surveillance. The reality was far less dramatic. Murrell was a criminal who operated mainly in Tennessee and Mississippi, stealing slaves and selling them multiple times by using disguises and moving them across state lines, a clever but not unprecedented scheme. He probably worked with accomplices, but there's no evidence of the vast organization Stewart described. The elaborate criminal empire, the initiation rituals, the insurrection plot, these appear to have been fabrications Stewart created to sell books and inflate his own importance as the hero who exposed the conspiracy. What makes this case study relevant is what it reveals about fugitive criminals in the popular imagination. The Murrell myth spread because it resonated with frontier anxieties, fears about the lawless backcountry, concerns about criminals operating across jurisdictional boundaries beyond the reach of law enforcement, and particularly Southern fears about slave resistance. The fact that people found a vast criminal underground plausible says something about early America's governance gaps. The Murrell case also shows how some fugitive criminals became legendary figures, whose actual stories were lost beneath layers of sensational narrative. Many famous outlaws of the era existed somewhere between fact and fiction, real criminals whose exploits were exaggerated to serve various purposes: selling publications, justifying vigilante action, entertaining readers. When Murrell was released from prison in 1844, he died almost immediately, possibly from tuberculosis contracted in prison. But his mythological version lived on, influencing American literature. Herman Melville referenced Murrell in The Confidence Man, and contributing to the outlaw legends that would flourish in the post-Civil War era. Case Study 4. James Copeland, Confession, Execution, and the Wages of Sin, 1823–1857. Sometimes fugitive criminals' stories ended not with escape, but with capture, confession, and execution, outcomes that authorities publicized extensively to discourage others from fleeing justice. James Copeland's case provides a detailed look at this darker trajectory. Copeland was born in Mississippi in 1823 and turned to crime as a young man, initially stealing livestock and gradually progressing to more serious offenses. By the 1840s, he was part of the Wages Clan, a loosely organized gang operating across the Mississippi-Alabama-Louisiana border region. The gang engaged in robbery, counterfeiting, and murder, exploiting the poor coordination between state law enforcement agencies. Copeland fled multiple jurisdictions over his criminal career. When authorities got too close in one state, he'd cross to another. When specific counties became too dangerous, he'd move to different regions. He used aliases and established temporary residences in various locations, sometimes under the guise of being a farmer or tradesman. This period of his life, roughly the mid-1840s to early 1850s, represents the successful fugitive phase, where he evaded capture through mobility and deception. However, his gang's continued criminality gradually built up law enforcement pressure. Unlike criminals who fled and then reformed, Copeland and his associates kept committing crimes, creating more victims, more witnesses, and more authorities determined to catch them. By the mid-1850s, improved communication, including telegraph lines reaching the Deep South, and better coordination between jurisdictions made evading capture increasingly difficult. Copeland was finally arrested in 1857 on murder charges in Mississippi. While awaiting execution, he provided a detailed confession to a local physician, Dr. J.R.S. Pitts, who published it as The Life and Confession of the Noted Outlaw James Copeland, 1858. This confession, which must be read carefully as it may have been edited or embellished, provides remarkable detail about the life of a fugitive criminal in the antebellum South. According to the confession, Copeland describes the constant movement required to evade capture, the network of accomplices and fences who helped dispose of stolen goods, the use of remote camps in swamps and forests as hideouts, and the psychological toll of living as a fugitive, always looking over his shoulder, trusting few people, unable to settle anywhere permanently. Copeland was hanged in October 1857 before a crowd of thousands. His execution was publicized throughout the region, and his published confession became a popular cautionary tale, part of a genre of criminal confessions that authorities encouraged because they reinforced the message that crime doesn't pay and that fugitives would ultimately be caught and punished. The Copeland case illustrates the ultimate fate of many fugitive criminals, capture and execution after years on the run. While some fugitives successfully disappeared and built new lives, others, particularly those who continued committing crimes, eventually ran out of places to hide. Social impact and analysis. The phenomenon of fugitive criminals in early America had profound social effects that extended far beyond individual cases, shaping frontier society, influencing law enforcement development, and contributing to enduring American mythologies about outlaws and the wilderness. First, fugitive criminals contributed significantly to frontier settlement patterns and social dynamics. Many frontier areas attracted not just hopeful settlers seeking opportunity, but also people fleeing something: debts, failed businesses, unhappy marriages, and yes, criminal charges. This created frontier societies with distinctive characteristics: a reluctance to inquire too deeply into neighbors' pasts, what we might call a don't ask, don't tell culture, a suspicion of outside authority figures who might be tracking fugitives, and an acceptance that people could reinvent themselves. This frontier individualism, the idea that people could start over regardless of their past, became a core American value, though it originated partly from communities harboring fugitives. Second, the success of fugitives in evading justice demonstrated the fundamental inadequacy of early American law enforcement and drove reforms. The frustration of watching criminals flee across jurisdictional boundaries and disappear highlighted the need for better interstate cooperation. The Fugitive Clause of the Constitution, 1787, and the Fugitive Act of 1793 were early attempts to address this problem, though their enforcement remained weak. Over the 19th century, improving communication, telegraph, railroads, national newspapers, and developing interstate law enforcement cooperation gradually closed the refuge options that fugitives had exploited. The formation of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency in 1850, one of the first organizations that pursued criminals across state lines, represented a private sector response to government inadequacy in tracking fugitives. Third, fugitive criminal communities like the Great Dismal Swamp Maroons created alternative social spaces that challenged mainstream society's boundaries and hierarchies. When fugitive white criminals lived alongside escaped slaves and Native Americans, sharing resources and creating their own social rules, they undermined the racial and class hierarchies that colonial and early American society depended upon. Authorities feared these spaces not just because they harbored criminals, but because they represented a form of freedom from control, places where the law didn't reach, and where society's outcasts could build communities on their own terms. This threat to social order was part of why authorities invested resources in eventually penetrating and disrupting these refuges. Fourth, the prevalence of fugitive criminals contributed to frontier violence and vigilantism. In areas where fugitives congregated, crime rates were often high, not surprisingly, since the population included many people who had already demonstrated willingness to break laws. This created cycles where violence begat more violence. Criminals attacked settlers, settlers formed vigilante groups to protect themselves, and these groups sometimes engaged in extralegal violence that created new fugitives. The regulator movements in the Carolina backcountry during the 1760s-1770s and similar vigilante movements elsewhere were partly responses to fugitive criminal populations that official law enforcement couldn't control. Fifth, fugitive criminals became folkloric figures in American culture, contributing to outlaw mythology that persists today. The stories of charismatic criminals who evaded justice, lived by their own rules in the wilderness, and challenged authority became entertainment and, in some cases, objects of admiration. This romanticization of outlaws, which would reach full flower with post-Civil War figures like Jesse James and Billy the Kid, began with early American fugitive criminals. The reality was usually far grimmer than the legend. Most fugitives lived hard, precarious lives and met violent ends. But the mythology of the noble outlaw, the man outside society's rules, became an enduring part of American cultural identity. Finally, the fugitive phenomenon highlighted the tension between individual liberty and social order that has always characterized American society. Should a person be able to move to a new place and start over, leaving their past behind? Or does society have the right, even the obligation, to track individuals and hold them accountable for past actions regardless of where they flee? Early America leaned toward the former. Modern America has shifted decisively toward the latter, but the tension remains. Modern connections, reflection. The world of early American fugitive criminals seems impossibly distant from our modern reality of instant communication, digital surveillance, and interconnected law enforcement systems. Yet the fundamental questions these historical fugitives raise remain surprisingly relevant to contemporary debates about justice, identity, and second chances. Consider the issue of identity and fresh starts. In early America, a fugitive could genuinely become a new person by traveling far enough that no one knew their past. Today, that's nearly impossible. Background checks, credit histories, digital footprints, and facial recognition technology make it extremely difficult to truly leave your past behind. We might think this is obviously better. Criminals can't evade justice as easily. But what about people who genuinely want to reform? Modern Americans who have served their sentences often find that their criminal records follow them indefinitely, limiting employment, housing, and social opportunities. Some criminal justice reformers argue for stronger expungement laws and right to be forgotten protections that would, in effect, give people the fresh start that early American fugitives achieved geographically. The question becomes, does society benefit more from permanent tracking and accountability, or from allowing reformed individuals to truly start over? The jurisdictional fragmentation that enabled early American fugitives finds modern parallels in international fugitives who flee to countries without extradition treaties. Roman Polanski, living in France to avoid prosecution in the United States for statutory rape, represents a modern version of the fugitive exploiting jurisdictional boundaries. Similarly, Edward Snowden's refuge in Russia after leaking classified information parallels how early American criminals fled to Spanish Louisiana or Native American territories beyond U.S. jurisdiction. The fundamental issue, how do societies pursue fugitives across boundaries between different legal systems, remains unresolved, just with different geographic scales. The existence of refuge communities like the Great Dismal Swamp Maroons raises questions about sanctuary and resistance that resonate with modern sanctuary city debates. When local communities choose not to cooperate with federal authorities in deporting undocumented immigrants, they're creating a form of refuge analogous to what frontier communities created for fugitives, spaces where certain laws are not actively enforced because the local population prioritizes different values. The arguments for and against sanctuary cities echo debates from early America. Does local autonomy justify non-cooperation with higher authorities? When is it appropriate for communities to protect people fleeing what they view as unjust laws? The mythology of the outlaw that developed around figures like John Murrell and Samuel Mason persists in modern American culture's complicated relationship with criminals who defy authority. We romanticize certain fugitives. D.B. Cooper, the hijacker who parachuted from a plane in 1971 and was never found, has achieved folk hero status despite being a thief who endangered passengers. Meanwhile, we demonize others. The criteria for which fugitives we romanticize versus vilify are revealing. We tend to admire fugitives who challenge what we perceive as oppressive systems or corporations, and who use cleverness rather than extreme violence. This isn't so different from how early Americans distinguished between social bandits, who supposedly only robbed from the rich and distributed to the poor versus common criminals who preyed on ordinary people. The surveillance technology and interstate cooperation that now make evading justice extremely difficult raise privacy concerns that didn't exist in early America. License plate readers, cell phone tracking, facial recognition, DNA databases. These tools make modern law enforcement far more effective than anything early Americans had, but they also enable surveillance of innocent people and potential government overreach. Early American fugitives benefited from the absence of these technologies, but so did everyone else's privacy. We face the perpetual balance. How much surveillance and tracking are we willing to accept to prevent fugitives from escaping justice? Perhaps most fundamentally, early American fugitive criminals who successfully rebuilt their lives raise uncomfortable questions about the permanence of criminal identity. If a murderer flees to the frontier, becomes a farmer, raises a family, contributes to his community, and lives peacefully for 30 years until dying of old age, was justice served or denied? Modern Americans instinctively say justice was denied. The criminal should have been punished. But if the punishment's purpose is rehabilitation and protection of society, did the fugitive achieve those goals through self-imposed exile and reformation? We insist on formal accountability, but early America sometimes achieved functional accountability through different means. The fugitive criminals of early America lived in a world we can barely imagine, a world where a determined person could disappear into vast wildernesses, reinvent their identity, and build entirely new lives beyond the reach of the law. Some of these fugitives continued their criminal ways, forming outlaw bands and preying on frontier travelers. Others genuinely reformed, becoming farmers, tradesmen, or even respectable community members. Still others existed in gray areas, living in refuge communities like the Great Dismal Swamp, neither continuing active criminality nor integrating into mainstream society. What united these diverse fugitives was the reality that early America's fragmented law enforcement, limited communication technology, fluid identity systems, and vast frontier spaces created opportunities for escape that simply don't exist in modern times. A criminal could commit a crime in one colony or state, and with determination and luck, successfully flee to another jurisdiction where no one knew their past and local authorities had neither the resources nor the incentive to pursue them. These fugitives shaped early American society in ways we're still grappling with. They contributed to frontier individualism and the American belief in second chances and fresh starts. They demonstrated the inadequacy of fragmented law enforcement and drove the gradual development of interstate cooperation and eventually federal law enforcement. They created alternative communities that challenged mainstream society's boundaries, and they became mythological figures whose legends contributed to America's complicated cultural relationship with outlaws and authority. The transition from a world where fugitives could successfully disappear to our modern era of pervasive surveillance and interconnected law enforcement represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between individuals and state power. We've gained the ability to hold criminals accountable across any distance, but we've lost something too, perhaps privacy, perhaps the possibility of truly leaving your past behind and starting over, perhaps a certain kind of freedom that comes from spaces where authority doesn't reach. As we face modern questions about criminal justice reform, about how long criminal records should follow people, about the balance between security and privacy, about when communities should cooperate with federal authorities, we're still wrestling with questions early American fugitives embodied. Can people change? Should past mistakes follow you forever? How much power should the state have to track individuals? When is fleeing from justice understandable, even if not justifiable? The criminals who escaped the law in early America are long dead, their specific stories mostly forgotten. But the questions they raise about justice, redemption, identity, and the relationship between individuals and state power remain as alive and unresolved as ever. What do you think? Should people be able to truly start over and leave their past behind, as early American fugitives could? Or is modern society's ability to track and hold people accountable across time and distance a necessary evolution? Should certain refuge spaces exist where the law doesn't reach, or does that inevitably enable injustice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this exploration of early American fugitive criminals fascinating, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the untold stories of American history, the people who lived in the shadows, the systems that shaped our society, and the questions that still challenge us today. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next historical investigation. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and share it with anyone interested in criminal justice, American history, or the complex ways our past continues to influence our present. Thanks for watching, and remember, understanding where we came from is essential to deciding where we should go.